Now that we're getting some raw data back, the next challenge is to try to figure out how to extract what we want from that raw data. Because oftentimes you're not just going to get the data you want, you're going to get a whole bunch of other stuff. Some status markers, some other stuff, some user information, whatever. Oftentimes the data you want is buried somewhere in that mass of other stuff. And so one of the things that we got to figure out is how to extract that data. Now, sometimes when you hit an API endpoint, you may not get text data like how we're getting for this cat facts endpoint. You may get something like graphical data, like if you're hitting, say, Google Maps and you're getting a map back, it may not be text. You may instead have to put in some embed code into your site, into your app that will embed that app or that map into your app. So it kind of depends on what kind of data you're getting back. If it's graphical data, like a map, then you may have embed code that you need to include. If it's textual data, like this CatFacts app, then we need to figure out how to extract that data. So the way that you're going to do this, the next step, really depends on what kind of data you're getting back. But in this case, we're getting some textual data. Now, as I said, oftentimes what we want is going to be buried in this massive stuff. So let's take a look at my panel here, my console. So I've hit the endpoint. I've got some data back. But the question is, okay, well, where's the data I want? I want a cat fact. Looks like there's all this other stuff. Okay, so part of it is learning how to interpret this data that comes back. And what you have to pay attention to, first of all, are the kinds of grouping symbols around different groups of stuff. So for example, notice that around this massive data, there are these curly braces. Curly braces mean that that data is what's called an object. And that's a specific kind of data structure for JavaScript. So an object comes with, the stuff inside the object, I should say, comes in pairs. So if you look at how this data is structured inside this object, you'll notice that things come in pairs separated by commas. So for example, you have status colon 200. You have status text colon OK. So you have all of these pairs of data that come, this data that comes in pairs that's separated by commas. So the first part, status, for example, like there, that's called the key. And then the second part, the value, is called the value. 200 is called the value. So the key is status text, for example, for that pair, and the value is OK. Okay, so when you have data coming back in these curly braces, that's called an object, and the data inside of it comes in pairs. They're called key value pairs. So the first part is the key, like status. The second part is a value, like 200. Okay, and you can have objects within objects. So inside an object, you can have another object. So that's how they often bundle data and send it back. Like for example, if you look at headers, this third key here, headers right there. Notice that the value associated with it is another bracket. Okay, so that means there's stuff inside of it. Config like this, there's stuff inside of that. So if I open up, say I open up and see what's inside. So let me expand this arrow here. You'll notice that config, this one right here, that consists of another object, another curly brace. And inside of that, you have these key value pairs as well. Okay, so you can have these objects nested within objects. Okay, now let's look at the first part, data. Okay, so let's look at the first key, data. And after that, there's a square bracket with some 3 dots inside. So the 3 dots mean there's more stuff inside, it's just not showing you. So when you have a square bracket as opposed to the curly braces, that means it's a list. So if you look at the next line, data right here. Okay, notice it's a square brackets, that means it's a list. Now we've come across lists before, if you remember when we did Snap and when we did Python. A list is just a single variable that contains a whole bunch of different values, and you reference or you get those values that are stored in your list by using the index. And the index is a number that tells you the position of the data inside that list that you want. Okay, so like if I expand this data, if I open up that arrow downwards, you see that there's things listed. There's a 0, there's a 1, there's a 2, 3. So those are the different indexes of the data inside the list. And for each index, there's another object. So you can see this is actually a pretty complicated data structure. So you have an object. Within the object, you have a list or an array, as it's sometimes called. You have some other objects embedded within that. So it's a fairly complex data structure. So the question is, well, how do we start drilling down to get to what we really want, which is a cat fact, which if you look kind of here, this is kind of where it starts, is all the way down, buried deep inside this list. There's this, it looks like starting here, for example, Wikipedia, starting with that word, that's where the actual cat fact is. So how do we drill down? Okay, well, the way I like to do it is I like to gradually work my way down from the top to the bottom. Okay, so let's look at our code, line 11 of our code. This is the print statement. Console log response is the statement that's responsible for printing out this entire chunk of stuff. This is all the stuff that we get back when we hit the endpoint. So this whole massive stuff. Okay, so let's start drilling down till we get to the level of where we can actually access this cat fact text right there. Okay, so if we look at it at the top level, we see the curly braces around the whole thing. That's an object. So to access a part of the object, one of these key value pairs, we need to specify the key. Okay, so do we want the status? No, that's just a number. Do we want the status text? No. We probably want data, because in that list data, there's where our, looks like that's where our cat facts are. So the first level we need to get down to is that data key from our object. Okay, so the way you get down to that key, that data level key, is you put a dot. Okay, so let's go up to line 11. This is the console log that prints out this whole thing. Now, if I want to drill down one level to that data list, the way I do it is I take my entire response and I put a dot and then the name of the key. Okay, so if you look at what I did on line 11, response.data. Okay, so that's how you access one of the values associated with the data key in your object. Okay, so you put the name of the key after the dot, and then that takes you down one level to that data list. Okay, let's try it out. So I'm just going to try the console log. I'll just print it on the console just so that we can see that will take us down one level to that data list. Okay, so I'm going to clear what's there now so it doesn't get all cluttered. So I'm going to just empty the log. I just click on this garbage can right there. That'll clear things out. And let's hit the endpoint again. Okay, so now what we get is we don't get the entire, if you look at what we get here in the console, it's not the entire bunch of stuff, not the entire object we get back. Now I'm just printing out just at the data level, which is that list. Okay, so it's a little bit smaller bunch of stuff to wade through. Still a lot of stuff. Okay, we still got to drill down a few levels to get to the actual cat fact, but at least we're getting closer. So we don't have the entire object response now, response object. Now we're just pulling out just that data value, which is that list. Okay, so now we're at that level. Okay, now it's a list. So now we want to drill down one more level to start to get the items in the list. Okay, so how do we access the items in a list? Well, we use the index, which is a number that tells us a position of the item in the list that we want. Remember that computers start counting at 0. Okay, so you'll notice if I kind of expand it out just to see what's inside of it. So I click on that down arrow. So notice the number 0, and then 1, and then 2, 3, 4, etc. So we're going to have to specify which one of these we want to get the cat fact from by using its index. So let's just start with the first one. So that's index 0 in this list here. Okay, so how do we specify that specific index? Okay, so let's go back to up to our line 11, our print statement. That'll print this out just to make sure we're getting what we want. So the way for a list that I specify the index is I use the square brackets. So after data, I'll put a square bracket with a 0 in it. Okay, so the number inside the square bracket in a list tells me which item from the list I want to access. I want to access the item at position 0, which is the first thing in the list. So I just want to get just this stuff right here. Yeah, I just want to play around with just that stuff right there. Okay, so I pull it off by taking index 0 from that data list. Okay, so let's try it. Let's print it out. Let's run it again. Let's print it out and let's see if we just get We're just expecting just this first item from that list. So just that stuff right there. Okay, so I'm going to clear it. I'll empty the console, click on the trash can, and I'll hit the endpoint again. So I'll hit my button. So now I get some data there. So there, now it's not the entire object response object. It's not the entire data list. Now it's just one item from that data list. So we're getting closer. Okay, so now we're down to this. Okay, this whole thing right here. So we look at that. That's enclosed in curly braces. So now we're at an object again. So what do we want from this object? Okay, so there's a lot of stuff there. Status, type, deleted, ID, user, all of that stuff, might be useful for somebody, but not for us. Looks like what we want is this guy right here, text. If you look at that, that's the key that corresponds to the actual cat fact. So that looks like our cat fact right there. All of this other stuff, although it might be useful for somebody, is not for us. So we want that text value in this object. Okay, so how do we get a value from an object? Well, we put a dot and we put the name of the key, which is text. Okay, so that should pull out this piece of text from that object. Okay, so let's see. So let's run it again and let's just see what gets printed out on the console. So I'll clear it so it doesn't get too cluttered. I'll hit the endpoint again, so I'll click my button. And now we get, if you look at that, now that's what we want. So there is our cat fact. Wikipedia has a recording of a cat meowing because why not? Okay, so that's what we want. Okay, so we have to kind of drill down. We have to start at the top level, see it's an object, then we pull off the piece we want from the object, which is the data list. Then from that list, we pull off the first element in the list, which is index 0. And then from that, which is in another object, we can pull off the text value, which was our cat fact. Okay, so that's kind of how I would do it. So now I know how to access. So what this taught me by doing this series of kind of drilling down and just looking at stuff on the console, haven't fixed my app yet. I still haven't displayed anything on the app. This is all behind the scenes, but that's what I've done is really important because now I know how to access the data from my response object. I know I get data, index 0 or index whatever I want, and then I get the text field from that, and then that will be where the cat fact is. So I've learned how to drill down in my response object and get the cat fact. Okay, so the last thing that we have to do now that we've figured that out, the last thing we have to do is, okay, now I know how to access that cat fact from that response object. How do I get it on the app screen? How do I put it on the app screen? And what if I wanted to even get fancy? What if I wanted to pick a new I wanted to do it randomly, say, and pick a new random fact every time I click on the button? Can I do that? Okay, well, let's first take a look at how I get that on the screen. Now that I know how to access that data from the response, I figured it out. Now let's talk about how do I get that cat fact on the screen so the user can see it. So that'll be our next thing.